Hey folks, this is Pat Quinn with the JoBlo Movie Network, welcoming film fans worldwide to a brand spanking new show that we're calling Show Me the Sequel. Sure, I know what you're thinking. We need more crummy movie sequels like 2020 needs more bad news. And what motivates Hollywood to greenlight so many sequels? It could be the popularity of a franchise like the Alien movies, or a specific character that's captured the audience's imagination, such as Freddy Krueger. Often, the films are based on a series of books. A recent example is the Twilight Saga. But usually it's a film with a big opening weekend that caught the studio by surprise, and now they want to cash in. Sometimes that's a good thing. Look at the sequels to Evil Dead, John Wick, and 28 Days. Occasionally, the sequels are better than the original, classics like The Bride of Frankenstein, George Romero's Dawn of the Dead, and of course, Jaws 3D. Okay, scratch that last one. Unfortunately, what we usually get is a generic rehash with a bigger budget and half the originality. Book of Shadows' Blair Witch 2 comes to mind. But we're here to talk about the sequels that Hollywood hasn't made, and in my opinion, perhaps they should. To start things off, let's take a second look at David Fincher's 1995 neo-noir classic, Seven. On the surface, Seven is a fairly straightforward thriller. Morgan Freeman plays William Somerset, a world-weary detective only days away from voluntary retirement. He's been partnered with David Mills, played by Brad Pitt, a brash young hotshot who's been transferred to the big city. Despite their differences, the two men develop a friendship as they track down Kevin Spacey, a deranged serial killer. One can easily imagine that same plot in a late-night flick on Showtime, except you'd have Lance Henriksen as the senior detective and Brian Bosworth or Mario Van Peebles as the hotshot. What makes this film special, besides an amazing cast and a great script, is the pervading gloom that director David Fincher and his production team create from first frame to last. There's a sense of decay, both moral and physical, in this unnamed city where the rain is constant and the sun never shines. One expects to see Travis Bickle drive past in his yellow cab, muttering about the rain washing the scum from the streets. The mood is quickly established in the opening credits. Images of the killer's meticulously created notebooks play under a remix of the Nine Inch Nails song Closer. Moments later, the detectives enter a squalid apartment and discover John Doe's first target, an obese man forced to eat till his stomach bursts. He's the victim of gluttony, one of the 7 deadly sins. And from there, the laughs continue. The second murder is greed and involves a literal pound of flesh. Next up at bat is Sloth, and the semi-living corpse of a drug dealer, courtesy of makeup effects artist extraordinaire Rob Bottin. Then, Somerset and Mills finally get a break. Using John Doe's library records, they get a lead on a possible address to his apartment. The killer shows up as they're knocking on the door. He makes a break for it, leading to the only true action scene in the entire film. Clues in the apartment lead them to the fourth sin, lust, and it's a doozy. A man is forced to rape a prostitute with a strap-on knife blade in a scene that I doubt New Line Studios would agree to if Seven were being made today. Though it's a gruesome concept, we only see the results and not the actions. The horrors of Seven are described and only shown in Polaroid glimpses. Fincher knows our imagination is far uglier than anything he could put on camera. That's when the script takes an unexpected turn. John Doe, who up until now has just been seen in the shadows, walks into the police station and surrenders. Kevin Spacey only has a few scenes in the film, but he really kills it, and reminds us that regardless of who he is as a person, the man can act. Now behind bars, John Doe refuses to cooperate with anyone but the two detectives, which, of course, leads us to the box. I assume we all know what happens next. If not, spoiler alert, in the film's last act, John Doe leads the detectives out into the countryside. This is the first time we've seen sunny blue skies in nearly 2 hours. A delivery truck shows up with a package. What's in the box, you ask? Gwyneth Paltrow's head. This would have been a perfect place for a goop joke, but I couldn't come up with one. But feel free to add one of your own. Anyway, it's at this point that John Doe tells an understandably upset Brad Pitt that he envies his life, which is his sin. Overwhelmed with wrath, Pitt shoots Spacey, completing what John Doe calls his finest achievement. Brad Pitt gets taken to jail, Morgan Freeman quotes Hemingway, and we roll credits. Screams for a sequel, doesn't it? The head-in-the-box ending was in the original script, but New Line had it changed to a more traditional action-oriented finale. This was back when actors like Al Pacino and Sly Stallone were involved, and the studio was courting directors such as Jeremiah S. Chechik, whose main claim to fame was National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation. Fortunately, that surreal scenario never happened, though it might have been worth the price of admission to see Randy Quaid chewing up the scenery as the killer John Doe. Eventually, New Line approached David Fincher, who was still bitter over his experience making Alien 3. In fact, he didn't read any scripts for a year and a half. Ironically, when he agreed to read 7, New Line sent him the wrong version. This one still had a head in a box. Alternative endings were discussed, including one that replaced Gwyneth Paltrow with the head of their pet dog in the box. But Brad Pitt agreed with Fincher, so that's the version that was shot. You could say that when it came to dealing with the studio, David Fincher never lost his head. It must have been the right decision since 7 grossed $327 million worldwide, and that's in 1995 dollars. Today, it's considered one of the best and most influential films of its type. Try to imagine television shows like Hannibal, The Following, and Fincher's own Mindhunter without 7 paving the grim and gritty way. So why make a sequel? John Doe is dead, Brad Pitt's in prison, and Morgan Freeman is being Morgan Freeman somewhere out on the farm. That's not going to play in Peoria, as my dad liked to say, but perhaps that's not the way things would have turned out. For example, as Pitt is taken away, R. Lee Ermey, who plays the tough but sympathetic captain, asks the retiring senior detective where he'll be, and his answer is simply, around. Also, just before the fade to black, we get Morgan Freeman's voiceover, which includes that Hemingway quote I mentioned earlier. The world is a fine place and worth fighting for. I agree with the second part. Does that sound like a man ready to retire? Not so much. And we get the impression that Brad Pitt's earnest belief that a cop can still make a difference has gotten to the crusty old detective. Maybe he's tired of playing chess by himself and throwing a switchblade at the closet door. Maybe his story deserves another chapter. As far as Brad Pitt goes, sure, he shot a prisoner in handcuffs, but he's a cop. The circumstances were unusual, and no one was around to film it with their phone. Chances are he got a pretty light sentence. And once he got out, then what? Does he blame himself? Does he blame the system? Is he filled with righteous anger? Does he want to dress up like a bat and devote his life to fighting crime? That job is already taken.
I'm Batman.
Okay, let's discuss the plot for this theoretical sequel to 7. Remember Buck Henry pitching The Graduate Part 2 to studio exec Tim Robbins in Robert Altman's The Player? The rabbit hole of bad ideas for sequels is deep, and one has to be careful. For example, let's say John Doe had a twin brother who wants revenge when Brad Pitt is released from prison. Too obvious. Alright, let's try this. John Doe had an illegitimate son who wants to follow in Daddy's footsteps. Even better, he had a daughter, and we get Jane Doe rebooting the 7 Deadly Sins. The studio always wants to appeal to a younger demographic, so maybe it's Michael B. Jordan as Morgan Freeman's son, and Margot Robbie as Brad Pitt's daughter. He's a cop, she's the district attorney. Together, they track down Jane Doe, who's naturally played by Charlize Theron. Why? Because Charlize kicks ass, that's why. Okay, there's your sequel. Done! Well, that's the version Tim Robbins probably would have signed off on, but I doubt that David Fincher would touch that script with a 10-foot pole. After rewatching 7, it struck me that as dark and nihilistic as the film is, there are some positive notes. Freeman, Pitt, and Paltrow's characters all believe there is still good in the world, and unlike John Doe, they believe we have to rise above evil rather than accept it. So that being said, here's my pitch for a sequel to 7. Morgan Freeman did retire as a detective, but he never left the city. Now, he's an independent crime scene investigator. Urban life is just as grim, and in some ways worse, due to the upcoming state election. Running against the first-term governor is a hard-on crime candidate who wants to use the death penalty to clean up the streets. The election has divided the city and led to nightly clashes between far-right and far-left protesters. Sound a little familiar? Morgan Freeman sees a YouTube post of a march and recognizes Brad Pitt amongst the far-left protesters. He knew his old partner had been released, but had no idea where he was, until now. Amidst all this turmoil, stolen copies of John Doe's diaries have begun showing up on the internet. A small group of extremists have adapted the diaries as a pseudo-manifesto, but they aren't looking to punish those who've committed the 7 deadly sins. They are preaching the 7 virtues. Wait a minute, the audience says, scratching their heads. What 7 virtues? I'm glad you asked. Along with the 7 sins, the 7 virtues were part of an epic poem with the catchy title of Psychomachia that was written by Aurelius Clemens Prudentius, a Christian governor who died around 410 AD. In case you're not up on your virtues, they are as follows: chastity, temperance, charity, diligence, patience, kindness, and humility. As with John Doe before them, these extremists want to make a statement. The only way to save the world is to live a life of virtue, and if you don't, there'll be hell to pay. Their first victim is a man who's made millions with online pornography. He's killed in the name of chastity. Morgan Freeman sees a connection between the murder and what happened 25 years ago. He goes to the police, but they think he's just obsessed with John Doe. Freeman manages to track down his old partner, but Brad Pitt is still bitter over the death of his wife and believes that you can only fight violence with violence. Eventually, the men resume their friendship and try to stop the killers before more murders can happen. Okay, obviously it's just an idea and not necessarily a good one, but it does reflect our times and continues the moral conversations of the first film. Not to mention, you could have some pretty unsettling murders inspired by virtues like chastity and temperance. Anyways, that's my pitch. Time to hear your thoughts. Think this could be a cool movie? Or is the idea of a follow-up to 7 ridiculous? Just remember, they did make sequels to Chinatown and Rosemary's Baby, so anything's possible. And on that note, I'm Pat Quinn, and I hope you enjoyed this exploration into the world of What If. Stay tuned for our next episode of this brand new show that we call Show Me the Sequel.